Hi, you've reached the presentation Open Source Collaboration from A to Z. We're going to talk about collaboration as in people working together for a shared benefit. And specifically, we're going to talk about how it happens in real life and how people benefit from it. And the A to Z is an interesting thing. We'll get into that. It's fun, but it's also relevant because A is for Armeria, which is a Line open source project, and Z is for Zipkin, which is an open source project that Line contributes to but doesn't own. We'll talk about the relationship between these projects also. My name is Adrian Cole, and let's get started. So we're here to hear about interesting stories and how to benefit while giving. And I call attention to this because as an open source maintainer, one thing I notice a lot of times is people are nervous that their company is not going to see the open source work as anything except for giving to another party, that we are giving a gift and there's an implicit idea that we're not receiving in the process. So I'd like to dispel some myths around that and give you some real stories and real benefits, real outcomes that happen that are not in one-way direction. Specifically, I'm talking to you because I love open source volunteers and I've been working in open source for over 10 years. I've started a few projects. I maintain projects I haven't started. I've gotten to know Line very well over the last few years. I both contribute to Line open source and Line developers contribute to the open source that I work on. I want to tell stories about those things because I don't want it to be that someone has to spend 3 or 4 or 10 years to learn the same thing. If we learn something, if we learn some insights about our behaviors with people we work with who are not co-employed, it's a good thing for everyone to know. And community-centric open source is reliant on unpaid contribution. So there's some interesting side effects to how collaboration works there that can be useful, especially around communication in your day-to-day job. Besides one starting with A and one starting with Z, Armeria and Zipkin are good for this presentation too. Right now, a lot of people are developing services, architectures, using a term microservices for having well-defined boundaries between the components that make up your business apps. Armeria is a framework to build those products, especially particularly the Java services. It's an open source project. Line founded this project. It's managed fully by Line, although it has a lot of open source contributions, including from people like me. If you're developing microservices, you want to understand whether they're performing correctly or not. One of those things is to try to figure out if a request is slow. Why is it slow? Zipkin is a project that helps you trace microservices to understand a request hopping from here to here to here and how much time it takes. So these are actually two interesting tools that are useful and relevant in modern application architecture. Also, these two open source projects are very good for first-time contributors. They're humbly led. They have a lot of unpaid contributions. They're used to working with people in different time zones and speaking different languages. And so they're a great place for you to start your open source experience if you haven't before. So there's a second benefit here, which is that these are safe harbors for you to start your open source journey if you've not before. And why Line? Well, of course, Line made Armeria. Line made this conference you're at. Line are also contributors to the software that I work on. There's been a long history of that. And I do want to show how a company can move from being on the sidelines of a project to being co-contributors to it. So let's talk about this collaboration word again. What's in it for you? So Trustin Lee is the founder of the Armeria project, and he's also a founder of a very popular project called Netty. And one of his insights is that open source collaboration is a win-win. projects need to be relevant. They need to have feedback from end users to be developing the right thing, to have the right features continue to work. The people who participate in it are also growing through the process. They're getting a second or third context in their software experience that transcends their employment. And they're able to learn skills from people who they may never work with face-to-face. So let's start talking about some real episodes here. The first one we'll talk about is something from around 2015 to 2016, so about almost 5 years ago. And the Line shop was re-architecting their application architecture, moving from synchronous logic hosted by Tomcat to asynchronous logic hosted by the new project they were developing called Armeria. Now, this in real life means that instead of having requests happen one by one, so if each one takes 3 seconds and you have 4 of them, then you have a long process over 10 seconds, that you're going to asynchronous, where you're looking to get very efficient, meaning that only slightly longer than the longest step. And so Armeria's goal was to allow for this parallel programming practice to be easier and safer to use in Java applications. But there's always a question about whether it's actually working or not, and how do you know if your intent was met? So Anurag, had joined Line. He was working at Google before, and he worked on a project there using a tool called Dapper, which allowed you to understand requests and how long they take. And Zipkin was a project that provides similar functionality, but open source and not specific to Google. And so he knew about that project. Line knew about Zipkin also because another engineer before him had introduced it in another department, but Line shop wasn't using it yet. So Line had just implemented Elasticsearch backend for their application data. Didn't want to manage 2 different types of storage, but Zipkin was primarily a Cassandra for production use at the time. So there's a conflict there in that they want to use the product, but want to use it a different way than it was currently set up. So to change any product's storage backend can sometimes be a big job, but you have to start big jobs with small jobs. Experiments are an important part of software development. They're equally relevant, and in fact more relevant in open source than internal work. If you go to an open source project and say, oh, I would like to change everything, the project maintainers may become nervous about that because this may be a lot of effort, and is this even going to benefit you or not? It's always good to start with an experiment if you can. So after experimenting with a proof of concept inside of Line, Rag found that this was a tenable idea and wanted to allow Zipkin's upstream, the actual open source project, to work directly with the version of Elasticsearch Line shop was using at the time, which was version 2. These discussions started with issues, a chat application that we use called Gitter, which is similar to Slack, and conversations, revisions. It must have been a month or longer, actually, before this feature was developed. And the time was getting people on the same page, understanding the long-term impacts, and trying to simplify designs so that volunteers can maintain it. There was also time that Rag had to spend on context switching, getting, using different tools than they use internally, using different chat systems, things like that. So it did take a lot of effort for Line to develop this. It would take it longer than if they had done it on their own. But Line were able to do it and not have to carry on that development as a full-time job. So once Zipkin embraced this project and harbored it inside of its code base, the community owned the progress of migrating that from later versions. As Elasticsearch changed its own schema, the project itself took on that burden. And Rag eventually switched to a different employer, When he did that, he found that he still needed this type of tool. He wanted to use Armeria in his next job, so he used Armeria. He was no longer a line employee. But he also wanted to use Zipkin, and in that job, they were using Google Cloud instead of Elasticsearch. So he carried that experience forward with him and had a much easier time the second time because he already was familiar with the tools, processes, and change culture of that open source project. The irony is that even though Zipkin itself changed its whole server to actually use this project Armeria, which I keep mentioning later, the version of Zipkin used inside of Line is not using that. So one reality, and I do want this to be a presentation about reality, not just marketing, is that you may not be able to upgrade exactly when an open source project decides to do something, even if it's your own tool. And so there's flexibility that needs to happen in order to work effectively in open source, meaning that you have to understand that the project may take a slightly different direction or a different timing of a direction than you might on your own. Having mutual trust helps make sure that there's a hope through that process and that things will resolve and eventually converge in everyone's favor. Let's talk about UI development. Anyone who's done UI development knows it's a big task. The projects move so quickly, the technology changes so often. Igarashi is a line employee. He joined directly after university. He joined into a complex team called observability. This is a team that includes functions of monitoring and metrics and logging, and now tracing as well, as we learned because the line shop example I just mentioned. So he had a task to improve the user experience, UX, of tracing, but he has challenged because IMON is a web interface internally used, but it's a 10-year-old system. It's more difficult to add new features to it. Zipkin's user interface was also quite old in its design, even though it had been renovated internally a few times. And so there's a tension between doing forward work in an existing code base. And so the way he did it was it took a very large effort to do a proof of concept user interface branded as IMON, internal to Line. And this presented some tracing features that were common between the open source Zipkin and the internal one, and also a couple of features that would help Line specifically. With folks that I will talk about later, we found that this is not something that only Line could use, and that it would be a better benefit to have the open source community able to use the same code and effectively be able to leverage the large work that it takes to use a UI. The challenge is that the open source project had been around for a long time. It had many, many features. So there were still a lot of features to develop besides what was done in the sprint. And so that's a lot of time. It's a lot of work. Also, the community of Zipkin had primarily spoken and written in English. Igarashi is more comfortable in Japanese, although he does speak English. And so when you're doing difficult technical designs, we had to use different tools to convey concepts. So we learned to become better at communicating visual elements, including when we were face-to-face using drawings, annotating images in, for example, OS X Preview, capturing animated GIFs using a Giphy application, and otherwise using chat to clarify and try to be succinct in how we communicate so that folks who speak a different language can more easily translate. Through these collaborations, Zipkin ended up with a brand new UI. It's extremely popular. And in fact, we have users in Zipkin who prefer this to the commercial products. This has all been due to Line and specifically Igarashi's great design skills. he has more code satisfaction in knowing that his work is used by so many people now. He's also learned a lot more through the process than he would have if he was just alone and working on UI with no other people to contribute. The user interface features are co-owned, meaning that bug fixes, while Igarashi still does a lot of the work, are often done by other community contributors, and any back-end work are maintained without his requirement to participate in that. But Igarashi does struggle with task management. He feels overwhelmed with work frequently. There's questions that come up in his mind. Is this work I'm doing for a company or not? Should I do this after work? And as a developer, it's important for managers to communicate that it's okay to work on things during company time. We'll get into strategies for that. Developers often feel like they want to do the best job they can for the company. And so it's very important. And Igarashi did have a lot of good feedback from his managers to condone the practice of working in open source towards mutual gain. We're going to switch context to something a lot different in some ways than the routine engineering talks. This is about open source program office. Now, this is a function that larger companies like Line with large development communities will have. It's the open source program office is what manages a portfolio of software that you have, relationships, conferences, all sorts of public outreach, and also internal training, policies, dealing with IP issues. So-Yeon is an amazing person that works at Line in Korea, and she sees collaboration key to making Line open source more popular and letting other Line developers learn more than they would have if they were only using internal mechanisms. For example, Line is a project in her portfolio. Zipkin is not specifically, but they're a key partner. Armeria users end up glancing at Zipkin through these partnerships and vice versa. The communities grow together. The practices that are used in open source for communication are extremely relevant today in the COVID-19 pandemic world, where so many more people are working remotely and they don't see each other face to face. The open source communication gives a chance for developers inside of your company to learn how to be more asynchronous, to do work non-blocking, to communicate clearly technical and otherwise decisions such that they can be more efficient. And these skills are equally useful as you change departments or end up in work from home scenarios. The collaboration between So-Yeon and her representation of Line and the Open Zipkin project, which is the community that manages the Zipkin project, were fundamental and deep. So-Yeon used primarily Slack to broker some logistics and some legal and IP concerns around granting of code that I just discussed that Igarashi had worked back to the Zipkin project so that it could be the primary user interface of Zipkin. These are complex discussions. For example, Open Zipkin is not a company. Line is, where are lines drawn? I was amazed working with her that I think it was only one, or maybe maximum 2 video calls. She's extremely good at asynchronous communication, and she's extremely conscious of not placing burden on other people, filling up their calendars. When you're working with volunteers that don't work for you as an employer, it's very important and something that So-Yeon has learned about, which is to be empathetic to other people's time while you're working together towards a goal. She's gotten her hands dirty. She is in the code history of the Zipkin UI. She worked on things including refacing, and she owned the project of updating the logo, which had been used for the previous several years, to something more modern that Line had designed and granted. And last but not least, she organized face-to-face meetings, and these are something that maybe is less available these days with the pandemic, but is a good tool to have when things are relevant for it. The Zipkin community, a few of us were able to meet face-to-face the few folks working on Armeria, and that human connection is a luxury that we have So-Yen to thank for. As outcomes, I can say that these two projects are basically partners. We are mutual beta testers. Zipkin primarily uses Armeria now. It's actually more like an Armeria project than anything else. The co-contribution helps both of us find and resolve issues faster. The branding has been amazingly helpful mutually. And So-Yen believes that this communication sharing between the open source communities, because we have such a close relationship, gives a relevant place for Line employees to practice those skills that they can take home with them for work from home, or they can take with them to different departments as they move around the organization. A key partner with So-Yen and Igarashi's bosses at the time was Hoi. Hoi was an observability engineering manager at Line through all these things, except possibly the first chat about RAG. And this is a manager's perspective of open source. So Hoi is an infrastructure manager in the observability team, and his goals are slightly different than an engineer or a program manager insofar as he wants to develop and ship ideas faster, transfer knowledge to the team, and bring operational relevance to these communications. Meanwhile, he shares the same goals of So-Yen. He wants to promote the Line brand, makes hiring easier, and gives his staff another opportunity to be proud of their work. One thing I think is subtle about this is that when you're working with experts in the fields, you're able to transfer those knowledge internally because of these direct relationships. You can vet ideas faster. He was talking to me about some storage performance degradation problem that would have been more difficult for them to solve internally without being able to talk directly to the project team. And he's also proud of what Igarashi has become and much better developer, having all of these experiences despite the workload involved. The collaboration between Hoi and the Zipkin project was very routine chatting, issue elaboration. He also did some interesting things, for example, adding site documentation so that people who are volunteers who don't work at Line can understand the needs of Line architecture when they're discussing problems, what's important to them. This is an interesting way to show that they're a power user of the product in a way that's better than just a marketing line. And he found that taking this distributed tracing knowledge internally had dual benefit. Of course, they're going to become better at distributed tracing, but by him working directly with open source teams, it acknowledges to his staff that it's okay to spend time on open source, that is actually going to be a helpful and welcome activity in normal development. The outcomes of this were that the UI that they needed to do in order to enhance their observability platform ended up shipping faster than if they had done it alone. And some of these troubleshooting problems were solved faster as well. Getting access to the people who wrote the code, even in some cases it changed the code itself to make it easier to understand. We discussed the team development. there's more opportunities to brand the teamwork. So for example, in Zipkin, we code-named the line work Project Lens, which we still sometimes use today as a, well, actually, we literally use it today as a project name. Zipkin benefited immensely through all of this. With manager buy-in, all of these other activities happened a lot more smoothly. And of course, it's great to have a famous partner when you're an open source project, and Line's very famous. So now we're going to talk about Armeria itself. So as you remember, Line has an open source program office. There's a portfolio of software in there, but there are a couple big projects there. One of them is Armeria, which is that microservices platform for Java. There's another one called Central Dogma, which is a configuration management system based on Zookeeper. And Minwoo is one of 2 engineers on this team. And if you can imagine, that's an immense responsibility. So Yen is also in the team. So it's not a large amount of people for such an important role in the company and in the community. Minwoo enjoys working with people with common interests. And as these are like really technical tools, it's neat to be able to collaborate, communicate, and become friends when you're in a small team. It makes it less lonely, and you have more perspectives of the same problems, second eyes to look at the same things with. When we collaborate together, Minwoo and Zipkin community, sometimes and often myself personally, it's almost on Slack chat or GitHub pull requests. I'm pretty frequently on Armeria Slack channel or raising issues. And sometimes problems are subtle. And I've found that working with Minwoo is very easy because he's expert. And I'm expert at certain things too. And so we can get to the bottom of issues together. And if I can't, other contributors can. And so we're never alone, really. This collaboration is usually manifesting in pull requests. Minwoo had mentioned a specific scenario to me about this request cancellation problem that would have been very difficult for them to identify if the product had shipped and someone noticed it a couple months later versus it being noticed exactly when it was shipped. Having a power user helps you identify problems the minute they arrive, as opposed to later when it can become more like a murder mystery. Minwoo is also a co-owner, meaning that he takes time to make sure that the software in both projects work. And while that sometimes means there's a bug in one or the other, the stake is in both. And the effect of that is an overall better ecosystem and much more reliable. So that's the outcome. Effectively, we are able to identify subtle problems in Armeria, fix them faster. It's an easier world when you have comrades and friends to work with. Even if your team is small, it's less lonely. And the tracing features in Armeria are quite good, and they're better because of the collaboration of Zipkin. The server in Zipkin is better because of the collaboration with Armeria. Both projects are technically provably better. The last person I would like to talk to you about is Koji. Koji is a line engineering manager in Fukuoka. He's a product engineering manager, meaning that folks that I've talked about so far on the engineering side have been more on the platform for infrastructure. But Koji's team are developing teams, I should say, developing like line shop servers themselves and the mobile applications you use to buy stickers. And so it can be a very different context as a product team than an infrastructure team. So Koji's goals are more about productivity, being able to troubleshoot faster, having more accurate data when you're trying to diagnose things like performance problems. He doesn't want as many bombs lying around. We understand that workarounds are a reality of product work. You may have to do a short-term changes or do something privately, which could be done in open source, but they eventually accrue technical debt, which makes upgrades in the future much more difficult. So he wants better options than just always doing workarounds. Also, he wants options to spread knowledge about things that the team relies on, not just within the team, but across teams. And you notice that in open source, it's much more effective than going and meeting team by team to explain a concept, because people naturally discover things when they're just doing web searches or looking at resources and products. So collaboration with Koji is a fairly unique thing. Koji is a middle manager, but he's also extremely hands-on technically. Koji raises pull requests, he raises change in the actual projects, changes the tracing code, changes Armeria, goes through revisions, active listener. He is a developer as well as a manager. And for the managers out there, not all of you are going to be able to do hands-on code, but in the case that you can, both Hoi and Koji have shown to their staff by their actions that collaborating directly in open source is okay. So as a manager, you may worry, or a program manager like So-Yen, when you communicate and you collaborate, whether it's changing code, requesting issues, submitting documentation, unblocking your staff, when you do that, you're telling your employees it's okay, and it's encouraged to work in open source. So this helps people balance their workload. Koji doesn't think it's good to work 100% product time, but it's also not going to help the company if the product team does not do any work on the product. So you have to find balance. Some people feel like 10 to 20% time is okay, or the occasional workshop of 100% time he could approve for his staff. But in some cases, he's felt like he needed to use his own personal time. So while he's worked on many of his changes on company time, I personally recall a workshop in Fukuoka where he took holiday time off just so he could work on code the whole time. And there are going to be different situations with different solutions to the problems. Managers are primarily going to be the best ones to lead staff into good judgment calls here, and leading by example is something that is something all three, So-Yen, Koji, and Hui have exhibited with their behaviors. The outcomes of this have been that his team were able to finally realize the full benefits of these technologies. It's very easy for people to say, use Armeria, use Zipkin, you'll get all of these things because marketing taglines say it. But product teams are usually the type of teams that discover whether something really works in practice when it's integrated inside of the software, whether it's used in the stickers shop. Problems happen. They limit the ambition. So he was very happy that through this connections that he made, through the code changes that he's done, he is able to have his team actually use the full benefit in reactive environments with these software as they were intended to be used. So it was no longer just an idea, but application and part of their process. And he feels his team are less nervous about open source because they can see him working in open source, and that tells them it's okay implicitly. Even if he says explicitly it's okay, when you do it on your own, it lets his staff know it's okay. So let's wrap up. I covered a lot of things here. I'm going to put some bullets on a slide, and I understand these are not going to be everything, but I hope that these things are some things that can feel helpful for you when you're referencing this in the future. So let's talk about the value proposition. We heard a lot of people say certain things in a similar way. It's a second way for you to have key knowledge transfer between your staff and your partners. It's a second context you have also. Your employees can move departments and they can retain and transfer skills. Someone coming from another company may already be familiar with the tools you use. They may be very good at it if they've already done direct open source collaboration. It's a win-win. The technology is only a small part of the skill sets that are improved when you're working with open source. Asynchronous communication skills are almost required these days, and open source forces this. It forces you to be more succinct, it forces you to communicate clearly and in a way that someone who speaks a different language can more easily translate. It's a great practice, and it's beneficial to all companies who work across borders and with different types of people. When you're directly involved in open source, you're de-risking the technology that you're using from day to day. You understand the designs and the future of the products, and you can influence those things. This allows you to also to have a better brand experience in hiring and your program management. And your more isolated team members feel less isolated because they're working as a part of a bigger team that extends outside of the company's walls. So in summary, what you can do, you can decide. But I think you can think of open source as a partner, as an extension of your team, and act in ways that's congruent with that. Think empathetically of these folks also, because they're often volunteers and they're not paid to do the same things that your staff might be doing. Plan for your first time change in any type of open source project to be slower than if you did it on your own and the second time. Don't make believe it's going to always be faster. Especially if you're in a manager position, lead by example. You may not be doing code contributions, but do what you can to make it evident to your staff that it's okay to work in open source. And help guide your staff, or if you are an individual contributor, be careful of overwork. And finally, be friendly, humble, and patient. And when you're asking time from others, they may be choosing between sitting on their couch and watching a film or working on this project. You want this to be an easy and happy place for everyone to contribute and collaborate. In closing, I personally want to thank everyone who's given me this insight into what open source means to them as far as collaboration is concerned. I've listed their GitHub IDs here with links, and you can click on them. Every single one of these people can be found in either Armeria's chat or Zipkin's chat in links that I've put down here. But if you've forgotten everything I've mentioned, I will hope that you remember one thing. Open source collaboration means you're not alone. When you're connected to the software that you work with and the communities that you work with, you have a second context, and it's a less lonely place, and it's a happier place. Thank you for your time. I hope that you enjoy this presentation. Please thank the people that helped me put it together.